Want to be upfront, my story writing will include a character who mentions a past suicide attempt, Rachel's equivalent, which appears in the original source story. I'll handle it carefully and briefly as context for the character's desperation, not with any detail, method, or romanticization, consistent with how it appeared in the original. If you're listening to this, I need you to stay until the very end, because this isn't just about a beach house or a piece of paper. It's about the moment I finally understood what I had taught my own children and what I had to do to save what was left of us. My daughter called me dramatic. My son said I needed to be realistic. And my younger daughter, well, she just stopped returning my calls altogether. So I handled it myself. I called my attorney, updated every document, and when they showed up at my cottage on the Oregon coast that October morning, keys already in hand, contractor quotes on their phones, they walked through the front door and found him sitting at my kitchen table. The look on their faces, I will carry that with me for the rest of my life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Rosemary. I'm 69 years old, and I've lived in the same town in coastal Oregon my entire life, Crestfield. Population just over 4,000. The kind of place where the grocery store clerk knows your late husband's name and still asks how you're holding up even 6 years after the funeral. I raised 3 children as a single mother. Not from the beginning. My husband Gerald and I had 23 good years before his heart gave out on a Tuesday morning when he was 58 years old. I was in the kitchen making oatmeal. He was getting ready for work, and then he wasn't. After he died, I went back to work full-time at the county school district, where I'd been working part-time as an administrative coordinator. I kept the house on Dunmore Street. I kept the cottage on Cape Halsey Road, the one Gerald and I had bought as a wreck in our early 30s and spent a decade fixing up board by board. And I raised our 3 kids the rest of the way. Nora, the oldest, was 27 when Gerald died. She lives in Seattle now, works in commercial real estate, and has the kind of polished confidence that always made me proud and, if I'm honest, a little uneasy. My son Todd was 24. He moved to Sacramento with his wife after the kids were grown and started a landscaping business that became something genuinely successful. He's always been the steady one, or so I thought. And my youngest, Abby. She teaches middle school science in Portland. Sensitive, emotional, the kind of person who cries at commercials. She was 21 when we lost her father, and I think she never fully found her footing after that. The 3 of them are my whole heart. That part never changed. What changed was everything else. It started on a Sunday in February. My younger sister, Connie, the person I have loved most in this world outside of Gerald and my children, called to tell me she'd been diagnosed with ovarian cancer. Stage 3. The doctor was cautiously optimistic, but Connie's voice on the phone didn't sound cautious. It sounded like she was already saying goodbye in her head, even if her mouth wasn't saying it yet. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table for probably 20 minutes without moving. Then I picked up the phone and called Nora. She answered on the 3rd ring. She was at brunch with clients, she said. Could she call me back this afternoon? I said, it's about Aunt Connie. She's been diagnosed with cancer. There was a pause. Then, oh, that's awful. Mum, I really have to get back to the table. I'll call you tonight, okay? I promise. She didn't call that night. She texted the next morning. So sorry about Aunt Connie. Thinking of you both. Heart emoji. I stared at that text for a long time. I called Todd next. He answered, which surprised me. I could hear the noise of a job site in the background. He listened while I told him, and his response was kind in the way that felt like he was reading from a script of how to respond to bad news. That's really hard, Mum. Is there anything you need right now? Because I'm actually slammed this week. We've got 3 installations going at once, but if there's something specific I can do, just let me know. Something specific. He needed me to itemize my grief so he could schedule it. Abby didn't answer at all. She called back 2 days later and cried, which felt like something. But when I tried to tell her how scared I was, she said, Mom, I know, but I can't handle hearing about this right now. I have my own stuff going on. I'll be better soon. I just need a minute. I gave her a minute. That minute stretched into 3 weeks. Connie started chemo that March. She lived 40 minutes from me in the same small coast town where we grew up, and I drove to every single appointment I could manage. I sat with her when she was sick. I watched her lose her hair. I held her hand when she was scared, which was often, even though Connie had never in her life admitted to being scared of anything. She had a daughter, my niece Wren, who was 38 and working 2 jobs to support herself and her 10-year-old. Wren showed up the way I always believed family was supposed to show up. She arranged her schedule around chemo days. She cooked and brought meals. She slept over on the nights Connie felt worst, curled up in the recliner in her mother's bedroom, so she wouldn't be alone. My own children came once, together in April for about 4 hours on a Saturday. They brought flowers. They sat in Connie's living room looking uncomfortable and left by 2 in the afternoon because Nora had a flight to catch. Connie didn't say anything about it until they were gone. Then she looked at me and said, "Rosemary, what happened to them?" I didn't have an answer. Something shifted in me that afternoon, sitting in my sister's living room after my kids had gone. I'd been making excuses for years. They were busy, they had their own lives, they were under pressure, they lived far away. All of it was true. None of it was enough. I started thinking about the cottage. The place on Cape Halsey Road had been in my family in a real sense for 30 years. Gerald and I had spent our anniversaries there. I taught all 3 kids to dig for clams on the beach out front. We'd had Thanksgiving there twice when the main house was being renovated. It was the place Connie and I went every August without fail. 1 week, just the 2 of us, since our 20s. No husbands, no kids, just sisters. I had always planned to leave it to my children equally. It seemed right. It was part of our family. But sitting in Connie's living room that day, I found myself asking, was it really? Or had I just told myself that story so many times I believed it? When had any of them last been there? Nora hadn't visited the cottage in 4 years. Todd had taken his family for a long weekend 2 summers ago and spent most of it on his laptop. Abby used to come with me sometimes, but she'd cancelled the last 2 trips because of vague reasons I never fully understood. The cottage wasn't part of their lives anymore. It was just a number on a future balance sheet. That realization sat with me all the way home. In July, Connie had a good stretch. The chemo was working better than expected. She had energy back, enough to take short walks on the beach, enough to argue with me about which movie to watch. She started talking about the future in a way she hadn't in months. One afternoon she said to me, "Have you thought about what you want the rest of your life to look like?" I said I thought I had. She shook her head. "I mean, really thought about it. Not just who gets the cottage when you're gone, but what you want while you're still here." Because, Rosie, she was the only person who'd ever called me that. "I've been watching you make yourself smaller for 20 years. You apologize for needing things. You frame every phone call as not wanting to bother anyone. You're waiting for your kids to show up the way you deserve to be shown up for. And in the meantime, you're putting your whole life on hold." I said, "That's not true." She said, "When did you last do something just for yourself? Something that wasn't about being useful to someone else?" I couldn't answer. Wren was in the kitchen making tea. She called out, "Grandma's right, you know." I said, "I know." Here is what I didn't tell Connie that day, because I didn't want to upset her. A week earlier, I had gotten a voicemail from Nora, not asking about Connie, asking about the cottage. Specifically, asking whether I'd had the roof inspected recently, because she'd been reading about property values on the coast and wanted to make sure we were staying on top of maintenance. As if she owned it already. I saved that voicemail. Then there was the group text. I don't remember exactly who started it. I think Nora, but all 3 of my kids were in it, and it was labeled family property. The messages went back weeks. They were discussing renovation timelines, which bedroom should be updated first, whether to keep it as a family property or eventually sell and split the proceeds. They had not asked me once. Not a single message in that thread was addressed to me. I found out about it because Todd accidentally included me in a reply. I didn't say anything right away. I screenshotted everything. I went to see my attorney, a man named Douglas, who had handled Gerald's estate and who I'd trusted for years. I made an appointment, drove the 40 minutes to his office, and sat down and told him everything. Douglas listened without interrupting. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" I said I want to protect myself. I want to make sure the cottage goes to someone who actually loves it for what it is, not what it's worth. He asked, "Do you have someone in mind?" I said yes. I want to leave it to Ren. He set down his pen. "You're sure?" I said, "She's been here every single week for 7 months. She rearranges her work schedule to drive her mother to chemotherapy. She doesn't have money. She's raising a child, alone. And she has sat at that kitchen table in the cottage with Connie and me every August for the last 12 years. She knows which cabinet sticks and which burner runs hot. She knows the name of the neighbor's dog. She belongs there." Douglas nodded slowly. "All right, let's make sure it holds up." We spent 2 appointments building the documentation. He arranged a cognitive evaluation. I took it, scored well, and was told by the evaluating physician that I was sharper than most people a decade younger. We recorded a video statement, which was harder than I expected. I had to do it 3 times. The first 2 times I started crying partway through. The 3rd time I made it to the end. In the video, I said, "My name is Rosemary Doughton. I am 69 years old, and I am making these changes of my own free will and sound mind. I am leaving the Cape Halsey cottage to my niece Ren because she has demonstrated through consistent action over many months the kind of love that I tried to teach my children but failed to model clearly enough. I love my children. I will always love them. But I have learned the hard way that love without accountability is just indulgence. I am not punishing my children. I am protecting what matters." When Douglas turned off the camera, he said, "That was good. That was very good." I drove home and didn't tell anyone. August came and Connie had a setback. The cancer hadn't spread, but the latest scans showed the tumor hadn't shrunk as much as they hoped. The doctors adjusted the treatment plan and told us to be patient. Connie was tired in a way she hadn't been before, bone tired. The kind that doesn't lift after a full night of sleep. Ren and I took turns staying with her. Some nights we were both there, the 3 of us in Connie's small house with Ren's daughter asleep in the back bedroom, Connie dozing on the couch, and me sitting at the table reading or just watching the light change over the water through the window. Those nights are some of the most painful and most precious of my life. My children knew the situation was worse. I had told them. Nora sent a fruit basket. Todd called once on a Sunday, and the call lasted about 8 minutes before he said he had to get the kids to practice. Abby went silent again. 3 weeks with no contact. I want to be careful here, because what I'm about to tell you, I didn't know yet. I know it now. I'll come back to it. The cottage text thread kept going without me. In September, Nora added a new thread, this time without accidentally including me. But Ren's daughter, who was visiting Nora's kids once as part of some plan I hadn't been told about, saw a message on Nora's phone and mentioned it to Ren without understanding the significance. Ren came to me quietly. "Aunt Rosemary," she said, "I think you need to know something." She showed me what she'd seen. Nora was researching coastal property law in Oregon. She had notes about the process for establishing power of attorney for an elderly parent who may have diminished capacity. There were screenshots of websites about contesting wills. I was 69 years old. I had just passed a cognitive evaluation with flying colors. I walked 3 miles a day and had not been to the doctor for anything other than my annual checkup in 2 years. They were preparing to declare me incompetent. I called Douglas that night. He said, "It's not unusual and it won't succeed. But Barbara," he always called me that, an old habit, I never corrected him. I want you to be ready for this to get worse before it gets better. I said, I know. And Douglas, I think it's time to tell Wren what's in the documents. He agreed. I told her the next afternoon. We were sitting at the cottage which I'd driven out to alone that morning to clear my head. Wren arrived and we walked the beach first, the way Connie and I always did before I could bring myself to say it. She stopped walking when I finished. She turned to look at me and said, Aunt Rosemary, I can't accept this. I said, yes, you can. She said, they'll think I manipulated you. They'll hate me for it. I said, they already barely tolerate you, and I don't care what they think of me anymore. I care what I think of myself. That cottage belongs to someone who knows which cabinet sticks. It belongs to you and your daughter. Wren didn't say anything for a while. We stood there while the waves came in and the wind came off the water, cold and clean. Then she said, okay, I'll accept it, but only if you let me keep the door open to them. Whatever happens, I don't want to be the reason your family breaks completely. I squeezed her hand. You're not the reason, you never were. October arrived, and with it, a certified letter from an attorney I didn't recognize. Nora, Todd, and Abby had retained counsel and were filing a petition claiming I had demonstrated signs of cognitive decline and requesting appointment of a guardian to manage my financial affairs and real property. I read it 3 times at the kitchen table. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from grief. I called Douglas. He said he had already anticipated this. He said they're going to use the cottage discussion as evidence of erratic decision-making. They may also reference any moments of emotional behavior, crying, withdrawing from contact, as evidence of instability. I said, so my grief over my dying sister is going to be used against me? He said, they're going to try. It won't work. What happened next, I'm not proud of, but I'm telling it anyway, because the whole point of this is the truth. I hired an investigator, not to punish my children. Genuinely, I needed to know whether they were doing this out of cruelty or out of something I was missing. I needed to understand what was actually driving it, because I had raised these people. I knew them before they were whoever they'd become, and some part of me couldn't believe this was who they really were. The investigator, a woman named Darlene who wore practical shoes and asked very direct questions, came back to me 3 weeks later with a folder I wasn't prepared for. Nora was in serious financial trouble. Her marriage had ended badly. I knew about the divorce. I hadn't known about the settlement. Her ex-husband had documented certain financial decisions she'd made, and she lost far more than she let on. She had a second mortgage on her condo. She was behind on private school payments for her kids and had taken out a personal loan to cover the gap. She owed close to $180,000. Todd's landscaping business was struggling in a way he had never mentioned to me. A large contract had fallen through, and he and his wife had burned through their savings dealing with the lawsuit from a former employee. They were not in foreclosure yet, but they were close. They had missed 2 mortgage payments. And Abby. Abby had been hospitalized twice in the past 18 months, not for anything physical. She had been in a very dark place and she had not told me. She was on medications that her insurance barely covered. She had debt from medical bills she couldn't touch, and she was still standing in front of a classroom every morning pretending to be fine. I sat in my kitchen and I cried for a long time. They weren't monsters, they were drowning. And instead of coming to me, they had decided to try to take from me, because somewhere along the way, I had taught them that asking me directly was worse than finding another way. That part was on me. I knew it the moment I read Darlene's report. I called Nora first. I said, I know about the debt. I know about the second mortgage. Silence. I said, why didn't you tell me? She said, because I didn't want you to know I failed. I said, failed at what? She said everything. The marriage, the money. I was supposed to be the one who had it together. You sacrificed so much to put me through school, and I've just been one disaster after another. I said, so instead of asking your mother for help, you decided to have her declared incompetent and access her property without her consent. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was different, small, the way it used to sound when she was young and she knew she'd done something wrong and was trying to figure out if I knew. She said, "The attorney suggested it. She said it was the fastest way to protect the assets before any rash decisions were made." I said, "Rash decisions, meaning my own choices about my own property." She said, "We didn't know what you were doing. Jennifer told us you'd been acting strange, that you were withdrawing and making decisions that didn't make sense, and we panicked." I said, "Who is Jennifer?" Long pause. She said, I said someone. Some people mentioned. I filed that away. I called Todd next. He answered on the first ring, which surprised me. He sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with the time of day. I told him what I knew. He didn't deny it. He said, "Mum, we're going to lose the house. I know that doesn't justify what we did, but I have 3 kids and we're about to lose the house, and I didn't know what else to do." I said, "You could have called me." He said, "And told you what, that I failed?" I said, "Todd, you have never failed at anything that couldn't be fixed. That's not failure, that's life. The failure is not trusting me enough to say so." He was quiet. I could hear him breathing. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Mum. I mean it." Abby was the hardest call to make. She answered, which surprised me even more. And before I could say anything, she said, "I know you know. Nora called me." I said, "How long have you been struggling?" She said, "A long time." I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And she said something that I will never forget, that I've turned over in my mind 1,000 times since, because every time I tried to tell you something was wrong with me, you made it about your worry. You cried, you blamed yourself, and I had to spend the rest of the conversation taking care of your feelings about my problems instead of getting help with my actual problems. I said, "Oh." She said, "I love you, Mum. I do, but I couldn't hold your grief and my own at the same time anymore. I stopped calling because I had nothing left to give." I said, "I know. And I'm sorry I made that the pattern." She started crying. I started crying. I said, "Abby, please tell me you're getting help." She said, "I am. I've been better these past few months. I owe so much, and my insurance is garbage, and I can't afford to keep going at the rate I'm going." I said, "I'm going to help you, but I need something from you first. I need you to be honest with me going forward, about all of it." She said, "Okay." I said, "And I need you to drop this petition." Another silence. Then I know. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I signed it. But Nora said. I said, "I know what Nora said. I need you to say no to Nora sometimes." She almost laughed. She said, "I've never been able to say no to Nora." I said, "I know. That's something we can work on together." Nora was the last piece, and Nora was not easy. She came to me, not the other way around. She called and said she wanted to meet in person, and I said, "Come to the cottage." That surprised her. I could hear it. She said, "Okay." She drove down on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October. I had called Douglas, and he was already there when she arrived. I had told him I wasn't sure what kind of meeting this would be. When Nora walked in and saw him at the kitchen table, she stopped in the doorway. She said, "You brought a lawyer." I said, "I brought someone I trust. Sit down, Nora." She sat. She looked older than I'd expected, which told me the stress had been real. She kept her hands folded on the table and her back very straight. I said, "I want to show you something." I set the folder from Darlene on the table. I explained what it was. I told her I wasn't sharing it to humiliate her. I was sharing it because I was done pretending I didn't know things I knew. She stared at the folder. She didn't open it. She said, "How long have you known?" I said, "A few weeks." She said, "And you didn't say anything." I said, "I'm saying something now." The room was quiet for a while. Outside, I could hear the ocean. I'd left the window open because the day was warm enough and I've always loved the sound. Nora said, I want you to know I know what I did was wrong. I've known for a while. I got in so deep with the attorney and the papers, and Todd and Abby were following my lead, and I didn't know how to stop. I said, you could have stopped any time. She said, I know. I said, I need to ask you something and I need the truth. Were you doing this because you thought I was actually declining, or because you wanted control of the property? She looked at her hands. She said both, at first. And then, I don't know. I think I convinced myself it was about protecting you because that was easier than admitting what I actually wanted. I said, what do you actually want? She said, I want to not be drowning. I want to be able to look my kids in the eye and tell them we're okay. She stopped. She said, I want you to not be disappointed in me. I said, Nora, I have never in my life not been proud of you. But I have been disappointed. There's a difference. She looked up. She said, I know. I said, here's what I'm willing to offer. All three of you drop the petition. All three of you commit to something: family counseling, monthly calls, showing up, not perfectly, just honestly. And I'll help you, not by signing over control of my property, but by giving each of you what you actually need right now. Real help, documented properly, no strings that turn into ropes later. She said, what does that look like? Douglas opened his briefcase and set 3 envelopes on the table. I said, for you, enough to address the most urgent debt. For Todd, enough to save the house. For Abby, enough to cover her medical costs and treatment for the next several years. Nora looked at the envelope with her name on it. She didn't touch it. She said, and the cottage still goes to Ren. I said, yes, that doesn't change. She said, she earned it. I said, yes, she did. Nora reached out and picked up the envelope, held it in both hands. She said, I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know who I became. I don't recognize myself anymore. I said, I know. That's actually a good place to start. We called Todd and Abby that evening on speakerphone. Todd agreed immediately, his voice breaking twice. Abby was quiet for a long moment and then said, okay, I'm in. I'm sorry. Douglas drafted the agreement that week. The petition was withdrawn. The family counseling started in November. All 4 of us by video first, since the distance made in-person sessions complicated, and then twice in person when Nora and Todd came down at Christmas for the first time in 3 years. Connie was stable enough that December to sit at the cottage table with us for Christmas Eve dinner. Ren was there with her daughter. My grandchildren ran in and out. Todd's youngest knocked over the centerpiece and nobody yelled. Nora poured wine and kept her phone in her bag all evening, which I noticed and didn't say out loud. After dinner, Connie and I sat on the porch wrapped in quilts, even though it was cold, watching the water the way we always had. She said, you did something hard this year. I said, I almost waited too long. She said, but you didn't. That's the part that counts. I said, are you still scared? She said, every day, but less than I was. She squeezed my hand. You? I said, less than I was. That was 8 months ago. A lot has happened since then. The counseling has been difficult in the way real things are difficult. Not dramatic, just grinding. The slow work of resetting 30 years of pattern. Our therapist, a woman who takes no nonsense and gives no easy answers, told us in our 4th session that the dynamic we'd built was one where love had become synonymous with service, and service had become synonymous with value, and that all 4 of us had been playing our roles in it long enough that none of us could see it clearly from the inside. She wasn't wrong. Nora calls me twice a week now, not always for long. Sometimes just to say she's driving home from work and wanted to hear my voice. I didn't ask her to do that. She started it herself. Todd paid back half the loan already, faster than the agreement required. I told him to slow down and take care of his family first. He said it helped him to be paying it back. I understood that. Abby is doing better. Not perfectly, not every day, but genuinely better. She came and stayed with me for 5 days in April, and on the third day we sat at the kitchen table and she told me, really told me, what the past 2 years had been like. I listened. I didn't cry in front of her. I saved that for later, alone, because that was my work to do, not hers to carry. She said, before she left, that she felt like she had her mother back, the version she remembered from before. I said, I don't think this version existed before. I think this is a new version. She thought about that. She said, I like this one better. The cottage belongs to Wren. The deed transferred in March. She calls it the family house, not her house, and she means it. She has already hosted all 3 of my kids there, separately, each for a weekend, and by all accounts those visits were quiet and kind. Connie is still fighting. The doctors are cautiously hopeful again, which is the most you can ask for at this point. She and I still go to the cottage every August, shorter stays now. Easier days, but still us. Still sisters, still watching the water. I'm 69 years old. I have a lot of living left to do, I think. I no longer apologize for needing things. I no longer frame every phone call as not wanting to be a bother. I've learned, slowly, the difference between asking for love and demanding it. And I've learned that the people who truly love you don't make you sort out which one you're doing. My children are not the children I imagined raising. They are messier, more frightened, more selfish in some moments, and more generous in others than I ever expected. They are real. And so am I. And real is so much better than the story I kept telling myself. I changed my will. I stood my ground. I almost lost everything I loved in the process. And on the other side of that, I found something I hadn't had in a very long time. The truth. And a family finally brave enough to live in it. I used to think the hardest thing about getting older was the body slowing down. I was wrong. The hardest thing is realizing that some of the damage in your life wasn't done to you. It was done by you. Slowly, with good intentions and open hands. I gave my children everything I could. I don't regret that. But somewhere in all that giving, I forgot to show them what it looked like to receive something back, to expect it, to require it, to hold the people you love to a standard, because that's what love actually asks of you. I taught them that I was a resource, and they learned the lesson perfectly. What I did with the cottage wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that, even now. It was the first honest thing I'd done in years. It was me finally acting in alignment with what I actually knew to be true, instead of what I wished were true. That's a harder kind of courage than the dramatic kind. It's not courage in a single moment. It's courage in a quiet room on a Thursday afternoon when no one is watching, and you have to choose between the story you've been telling yourself and the one that's actually real. Wren didn't earn that cottage by being a saint. She earned it by showing up, week after week, appointment after appointment, through the fear and the exhaustion and the grief of watching her mother get smaller. She made choices, hard, inconvenient, costly choices, because that's what she believed you do for the people who matter. That's not a personality trait you're born with. That's a decision you make, over and over, until it becomes who you are. My children weren't born entitled. I can see that clearly now in a way I couldn't when I was in the middle of it. They became who they were because the system I built rewarded it. Every time I absorbed a cost they should have felt, every time I smoothed over a consequence they should have faced, I was teaching them that care flows in one direction. That I was the giver, and they were the receivers, and that's just how things were. I loved them so much I accidentally made them smaller than they were capable of being. The year that followed, the counseling, the hard conversations, Abby finally telling me the truth, Nora sitting at my kitchen table and saying out loud that she didn't recognize herself. None of that happened because I forced it. It happened because I stopped pretending. I stopped accepting less than I deserved, and in doing that, I gave them the chance to rise to something better. That's the part nobody tells you. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to make it easy. I'm 69 years old. I have some years ahead of me yet, and I intend to use them well. Not in bitterness, not in waiting for apologies, but in actually living, Showing up for Connie, spending time at the cottage with Wren and her daughter, having Sunday dinners with Todd, taking calls from Nora that are just calls, nothing urgent, nothing needed. The cottage is still there, the ocean is still there, and I'm still here, which is the part that matters most.